On February 12, 1996, 5 bright university students from the D.C. area vanished along a desolate stretch of Interstate 59 while on a road trip to Mardi Gras. For 11 long years, the case was a cold, silent wound for their families, a mystery defined by a single clue: their abandoned Jeep Cherokee found on a dirt road in rural Mississippi. The official story was that they ran away, a theory their loved ones never accepted. The trail went cold, hope faded, and the 5 friends were relegated to the dusty archives of unsolved cases. For over a decade, the truth lay buried just feet from where they were last seen, until a forgotten suitcase, discovered during a demolition, revealed a deadly conspiracy that a small town had guarded for years. It was a discovery that would prove the families right and expose a darkness far deeper than anyone could have ever imagined. How is it possible that the truth remained hidden for so long, right under everyone's noses, protected by a wall of silence? How could 5 young lives be erased without a trace, with the very people sworn to protect them complicit in the cover-up? The answer is a chilling testament to the power of local corruption and the vulnerability of outsiders in a place where secrets are currency. Before I tell you how a simple suitcase found in a demolition site revealed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local law enforcement, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the chain of events that this single dusty discovery triggered, a chain that would ultimately lead investigators to a shallow grave and a justice that was 11 years overdue. The group was the very picture of youthful promise, a tight-knit circle on the brink of adulthood. Liam, 22, a Georgetown law student, was the responsible driver and organizer, the protector of the group. With him was Sarah, 21, a gifted art student who had poured her heart into hand-making their elaborate Mardi Gras costumes. Her younger sister, Emily, 20, a journalism major, was experiencing her first real taste of freedom on this trip, her excitement infectious. Rounding out the group were David, 22, Liam's pragmatic best friend and an engineering student, and Kevin, 23, Liam's cousin, a bit of a free spirit who had dropped out of college and would later become the investigation's convenient scapegoat. They were optimistic, intelligent, and completely unaware of the dangers that lurked in the isolated pockets of the American South, believing the world shared their festive spirit. Their journey began on a crisp February morning in a quiet Virginia suburb. The scene was one of familiar, comforting chaos. Parents offering last-minute advice, hugs exchanged, and the final bags being squeezed into Liam's dark green Jeep Cherokee. Sarah's mother later recalled her final conversation with her daughters, a simple exchange about staying together and calling every night. She remembered Emily's wide, bright smile, so full of anticipation for the adventure ahead. The car was more than just a vehicle. It was a vessel of dreams, packed with handmade costumes, cheap snacks, and the boundless energy of 5 friends who believed the road ahead led only to celebration. As they pulled away from the curb, waving goodbye, none of the families could have fathomed it was the last time they would ever see their children alive. The last confirmed contact came from a payphone at a gas station just off I-59 in Mississippi. It was Liam, calling his mother to check in. His voice was calm, reassuring. He mentioned the car was making a strange noise, so they were pulling off the main highway to find a mechanic in the next small town. He promised to call again once they were back on the road. That call never came. When the group failed to arrive at their rented New Orleans apartment, a quiet unease began to creep in. The families started calling each other, their conversations growing more frantic with each passing hour. Days turned into a week. The vibrant chaos of Mardi Gras, which was meant to be the backdrop for their adventure, now felt like a sinister curtain, hiding a terrifying truth they were not yet ready to face. The initial search yielded a chilling and deeply unsettling discovery. The Jeep Cherokee was found parked on a remote, muddy access road, miles from the nearest town. The doors were unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. Inside, a few maps and empty soda cans were scattered, but there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no indication of violence. Most disturbingly, all of their luggage, including the handmade costumes Sarah had spent weeks creating, was gone. The local sheriff's department, under-resourced and seemingly unmotivated, was quick to label the case. They pointed to Kevin's record of petty theft and suggested the five had simply run off, perhaps to start a new life or chase a wild, drug-fueled Mardi Gras fantasy. For the families, this theory was not just absurd. It was an insult, the first of many failures in a flawed investigation that would cost them 11 years of their lives. The families, arriving in a state of panicked disbelief, were met not with compassion but with a wall of dismissive bureaucracy. They descended upon the small Mississippi town, a frantic convoy of worried parents from the polished suburbs of D.C., and immediately clashed with the local culture. The sheriff, a man named Miller whose demeanor suggested he viewed their arrival as an inconvenience, offered them platitudes and lukewarm coffee in his cramped office. He spoke in slow, patronizing tones, repeatedly emphasizing how kids these days were unpredictable. Liam's father, a lawyer accustomed to demanding answers, found his questions deflected with vague assurances. Sarah and Emily's mother, clutching a photo of her girls, felt a chilling coldness in the room that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the first sign that they were utterly alone in their search, outsiders in a closed community that had already made up its mind. Sheriff Miller's investigation, if it could be called that, quickly zeroed in on a single, convenient narrative, the runaway theory, with Kevin as the designated villain. He latched onto Kevin's record, a minor shoplifting charge from his teenage years, and spun it into a tale of a troubled youth leading his impressionable friends astray. He suggested to the local press that the group had likely run off to fund a drug-fueled Mardi Gras bender, abandoning the Jeep as part of their plan. This story, simple and scandalous, was eagerly consumed. The families watched in horror as their children were transformed from victims into delinquents in the public eye. Their pleas to look for other possibilities, to investigate the strange noise Liam mentioned on the phone, were ignored. The official theory was not just a failure of police work. It was a character assassination that added a layer of profound insult to their unimaginable injury. Refusing to accept the sheriff's narrative, the families took matters into their own hands. Liam's father, Robert, a man of action and logic, effectively set up a command center in his dingy motel room. He spent his life savings printing thousands of flyers with his son's smiling face, organizing small search parties of volunteers, and methodically mapping out every possible route the group could have taken. Meanwhile, Sarah and Emily's mother, Eleanor, navigated her grief through quiet persistence, visiting local churches and community centers, her voice trembling as she begged anyone who would listen for information. The response was a disquieting silence. The townspeople would offer prayers and sympathetic glances, but their eyes would quickly dart away. It was a community sealed tight, and the families began to feel like they weren't just searching for their children, but fighting against an invisible, unspoken pact to keep them from finding the truth. Just as despair began to set in, a cruel glimmer of hope emerged. A tourist in New Orleans called the hotline, claiming to have seen a young woman matching Emily's description in the French Quarter. The woman, he said, looked dazed and was with a group of rough-looking men. The news electrified the families and briefly reignited media interest. Robert immediately hired a private investigator, draining the last of his retirement funds to send him to New Orleans. For 3 agonizing days, they waited by the phone, picturing a rescue, imagining their children disoriented but alive. The investigator chased the lead through crowded streets and smoky bars, only to discover it was a dead end. The woman was a local runaway with a passing resemblance to Emily. The crushing disappointment was a physical blow, leaving the families more depleted and heartbroken than before. It was a brutal lesson in the emotional economics of hope. The higher it soared, the more devastating the fall. The first year bled into the second, and the world began to forget. The national news crews packed up, the hotline calls trickled to a stop, and the case file for the Mississippi 5, as they were briefly known, was unceremoniously placed in a dusty metal cabinet labeled cold cases. For the families, however, time did not heal. It festered. The relentless uncertainty became a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundations of their lives. Robert's single-minded obsession with the case destroyed his marriage. His wife, unable to live in a home that had become a monument to their missing son, quietly left. Eleanor, Sarah and Emily's mother, fell into a deep, silent depression. She kept their bedrooms exactly as they had left them, the unmade beds and clothes laid out for the trip becoming a heartbreaking shrine. The silence in their homes was no longer peaceful. It was a deafening roar of absence. 5 years after the disappearance, the families, now bonded by a unique and terrible tragedy, channeled their grief into action. They pooled their remaining resources to create, quote, the Roadwatch Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to advocating for the families of the missing. Their mission was born from the bitter lessons they had learned, the jurisdictional nightmares of interstate cases, the damage of police indifference, and the pain of being ignored. Robert became a surprisingly fierce lobbyist, walking the halls of Congress to push for better communication protocols between state law enforcement agencies. Eleanor, finding her voice after years of silent sorrow, became a counselor for parents navigating the same ambiguous loss. The foundation was a way to create meaning from meaninglessness, a testament to their enduring love. But in the quiet moments, they all knew it was also a way to keep their children's memories alive in a world that had moved on without them. A decade passed. The 10th anniversary of the disappearance was marked by a small inside-page article in the D.C. paper, a brief mention of a mystery long since gone cold. The parents were older now, their faces etched with the geography of grief. On that cold February morning, Robert drove the long, lonely miles back to Mississippi. He parked his car near the overgrown dirt road where Liam's Jeep had been found. He stood there for hours, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. The hope of finding his son alive had long since died, replaced by a desperate, gnawing need for answers. What had happened on this desolate stretch of road? He stared into the dense woods, as if the trees themselves held the secret. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind, a sound that felt like a whisper he couldn't quite understand. It was the sound of a decade of questions, a father's unending vigil at the place where his world had ended. Then, in the summer of 2007, 11 years after the 5 friends vanished, the landscape of the mystery began to shift. Literally, the long-abandoned gas station on the edge of town, a skeletal reminder of a forgotten tragedy, was finally sold. A development company planned to tear it down and build a modern service plaza. For the locals, it was a sign of progress, a chance to pave over a place that had always felt haunted. A demolition crew was brought in, a team of men with no connection to the town's history or its secrets. Among them was a man named Roy, a quiet, methodical worker who saw the job as just another pile of rubble to clear. He had no idea he was about to unearth a truth that an entire community had conspired to bury for over a decade, a truth that lay waiting under layers of dust and decay. The work was dirty and monotonous. Days were spent tearing down the rusted awnings and breaking up the cracked concrete. One afternoon, while clearing out a dilapidated storage shed in the back, a structure that was little more than rotting wood and corrugated tin, Roy's crowbar hit something solid. It wasn't a rock or a piece of machinery. It was buried beneath a pile of moldy tarps and old, bald tires. He pulled the debris away and uncovered a large, heavy leather suitcase. It was old, the kind of luggage from a different era, its dark brown surface cracked and stained by years of dampness. The locks were rusted shut. It felt strangely out of place, too personal to be simple trash. A flicker of a long-forgotten local story, one about some college kids who disappeared, crossed his mind. He felt a sudden, inexplicable chill despite the oppressive Mississippi heat. Driven by a curiosity that overpowered his urge to simply toss it in the dumpster, Roy took his crowbar and pried at the rusted latches. They groaned, and then snapped open with a sharp crack that echoed in the silent, derelict shed. The lid creaked open, releasing a musty, stale odor of trapped time. Inside, his breath caught in his throat. The suitcase was filled with 5 elaborate, handmade Mardi Gras costumes. There was a jester's outfit, a feathered mask, a sequined vest, all now faded, discolored, and nibbled by moths. They were a ghostly tableau of a celebration that had never been attended. It was a profoundly sad and unsettling sight, a time capsule of joy interrupted. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that he had found something belonging to the missing students. The local legend had just become terrifyingly real, right there in his hands. As Roy carefully lifted one of the costumes, a delicate vest adorned with faded sequins, something small and plastic, tumbled from a pocket and landed softly in the dust at his feet. He bent down and picked it up. It was a disposable camera, a Kodak funsaver, its bright yellow and red casing a stark contrast to the gloom of the shed. It was a relic, an object so specific to the 1990s that it felt like a message sent across time. This, he realized, was more than just luggage. This was potential evidence. A wave of responsibility washed over him. He thought about turning it over to the local sheriff's department, but he remembered the old rumors, the whispers that Sheriff Miller had botched the investigation from the start. Trusting the local authorities felt like a risk. He made a decision that would change everything. He would get the film developed himself. The next day, Roy drove to a larger town an hour away, the camera sitting on his passenger seat like a fragile ticking bomb. He found a small photo lab and handed the camera to a young clerk, explaining where he'd found it. The clerk was doubtful, warning him that a film roll that old, exposed to more than a decade of heat and humidity, was almost certainly ruined. But he agreed to try. For the next 24 hours, Roy was on edge. He couldn't shake the images of those costumes from his mind. He imagined the young woman, Sarah, sewing them with care, full of excitement for the trip. He thought of the families who had waited for 11 years without an answer. The next afternoon, the phone rang. It was the photo lab. "You're not going to believe this," the clerk said, his voice filled with a strange mix of excitement and awe. Some of the pictures came out." Roy rushed back to the lab, his heart pounding. The clerk handed him a small envelope of glossy prints. He slid them out, his hands trembling slightly. The first 20 photos were a gut-wrenching chronicle of their final happy hours. There was Liam at the wheel, grinning. Sarah and Emily, sisters, arms around each other at a scenic overlook. David and Kevin making goofy faces for the camera. They were so young, so alive, so completely unaware of what was waiting for them just a few miles down the road. The images were a vibrant, painful testament to the lives that had been stolen. They confirmed beyond any doubt that the suitcase and the camera belonged to the missing students. But as he flipped through the stack, the tone of the photos began to change drastically, documenting their descent from a joyful road trip into a nightmare. The final 4 photographs were the key. They had been taken at the gas station. The first of these showed Liam arguing with a hard-faced older man, his posture defensive, his expression worried. In the background, the other students watched, their own faces etched with anxiety. The next photo, slightly blurry as if taken in a hurry by Sarah, was a chilling close-up of a large, brutish-looking younger man who stared back at the lens with an expression of pure menace. He was standing near the Jeep's front tire. The third photo was a chaotic shot of the inside of the car, as if the camera had been fumbled, and the final image on the roll was pitch black. It was the visual record of their last moments, a silent, horrifying narrative that pointed a clear finger not at some random predator on the highway, but directly at the family who owned that gas station. After 11 years of silence, the victims were finally speaking. Roy knew instantly that he couldn't take the photos to the local police. The whispers he'd heard for years about Sheriff Miller and his cozy relationship with the Calloway family, who owned the gas station, were too persistent to ignore. Instead, he made a call to a journalist he trusted at a regional newspaper, a man known for his relentless pursuit of cold cases. Within hours, the journalist was on the phone with Robert, Liam's father. When Robert saw the images of his son, alive and then afraid, the 11 years of ambiguous grief solidified into a cold, hard certainty. The horror of seeing those final, fearful moments was matched only by a surge of adrenaline. The fight he had waged for so long, fueled by faith and a father's instinct, now had its first piece of tangible, undeniable evidence. the silence was finally broken. The arrival of the photographs on the desk of a federal prosecutor changed everything. Under intense pressure from Roberts Foundation and armed with evidence that suggested a multi-state crime, the FBI officially reopened the case, classifying it as a homicide investigation. The sleepy Mississippi town was suddenly awakened by the arrival of federal agents, their presence a stark contrast to the casual indifference of the original investigation. The first person they visited was the now-retired Sheriff Miller. Confronted with the photos, the color drained from his face. The investigation was no longer about 5 missing kids. It was about the men in those pictures, the powerful and feared Calloway family. For the first time in over a decade, the official inquiry had a clear and menacing target, a family that had ruled the county through intimidation and secrets. The Calloway family was a local dynasty built on rust and intimidation. The patriarch, Earl, the hard-faced man seen arguing with Liam in the photo, was known for his ruthless business practices and his stranglehold on local politics. His son, Junior, the hulking figure who glared into Sarah's camera, was his enforcer. Junior had a reputation for a violent temper, a history of assaults and bar fights that mysteriously vanished from police records. The townspeople spoke of them in hushed tones, their fear a palpable force that had helped keep the secret buried. The FBI began to meticulously deconstruct their empire, digging into financial records, property deeds, and old police reports that had been conveniently misplaced. The photos had not just identified suspects, they had illuminated an entire ecosystem of corruption that had allowed a terrible crime to go unpunished. With the Calloways as the focus, FBI forensic experts revisited the original evidence, looking at it through a new lens. The blurry photo of Junior standing near the Jeep's front tire became a critical clue. They brought in a veteran automotive fraud investigator who analyzed the initial police reports and photos of the disabled vehicle. He quickly identified something that had been either missed or deliberately ignored. The power steering hose had been sliced with a knife, a clean, intentional cut designed to cause a slow fluid leak. The vehicle would run for several miles before the steering seized up, forcing the driver to turn back to the last place they saw, Calloway's Gas and Go. The strange noise Liam had mentioned on the phone wasn't a random mechanical failure. It was the sound of a carefully laid trap. The sight of federal agents methodically questioning everyone in town began to chip away at the wall of silence that had protected the Calloways for 11 years. Fear of the family was still strong, but the fear of federal prison was stronger. The first crack appeared when a former waitress, now a middle-aged mother living in another state, came forward. She told investigators she remembered the group of college kids vividly. She'd served them sodas and overheard a heated argument between Liam and Junior over a supposed repair bill. Later, she saw Junior storming toward the back of the property, his face contorted with rage. Earl Calloway had pulled her aside that night and told her if anyone asked, those kids never stopped. Her testimony was the first human voice to confirm the chilling story the photos told. While one team of agents was collecting witness statements, another was following the money. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit discovered that retired Sheriff Miller was living a life far beyond the means of a public servant. He had retired a year after the students vanished, citing health reasons, but had immediately purchased a lakefront house and a new boat, all paid for in cash. A deep dive into old bank records uncovered a series of large, untraceable deposits into Miller's account in the spring and summer of 1996. The transactions were traced back to a holding company, which was, after peeling back several layers of ownership, controlled by none other than Earl Calloway. The cover-up wasn't just a matter of misplaced loyalty, it had a price tag. Justice had been sold for a lakeside retirement. As the net tightened around the Calloways, with agents seizing records from their home and business, a crucial piece of the puzzle arrived in a plain white envelope at the FBI's Jackson field office. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typewritten message. They never left the property. The old well behind the shed. There was no signature, no return address. It was the voice of a ghost, someone from within that circle of silence, finally compelled by conscience or fear to speak. The message was chillingly specific, pointing to a location just yards from where Roy had found the suitcase. Investigators now had a target for their search, a place where they suspected the final, horrifying chapter of the student's journey had been written. The grim task of excavation was about to begin. The anonymous tip sent a jolt through the investigation, transforming it from a methodical reconstruction of the past into an urgent search for the present. On a sweltering August morning, an FBI excavation team descended on the Calloway property. The air was thick with tension as they sectioned off the area behind the old, dilapidated shed. The target was a circular stone structure, nearly swallowed by weeds and sealed with a heavy rusted iron plate, the old well. For 11 years, it had been a forgotten feature of a decaying landscape. Now it was the focal point of a national investigation, the potential tomb for 5 young people whose faces had haunted their families for over a decade. As the heavy machinery began to break through the seal, a silence fell over the team. Everyone present understood the gravity of what they were about to uncover. They weren't just digging for evidence. They were digging for answers. It didn't take long. Less than 10 feet below the surface, after clearing layers of dirt and debris that had been dumped to conceal its contents, a shovel struck something solid but yielding. The work slowed to a painstaking crawl as agents began to excavate by hand with brushes and trowels. First, a piece of fabric emerged, then a bone. Soon, the grim reality became undeniable. The well contained the skeletal remains of multiple individuals. Forensic anthropologists, standing by in the oppressive heat, were called in to begin the delicate process of recovery. It was a somber, sacred task performed under the cold, professional gaze of the FBI. The remains were carefully unearthed, one by one, a heartbreaking inventory of a crime hidden for 11 years. For the families, who were notified immediately, this discovery was the final brutal confirmation of a truth they had long suspected but always feared. The long winter of not knowing was finally over, replaced by the devastating certainty of loss. The news of the discovery shattered the town's fragile silence. It was the final push needed to break the man who sent the anonymous tip. Racked with guilt and terrified of being implicated as an accomplice, a former Calloway employee named Dale Mathis walked into the FBI field office and confessed everything. For 2 days, he sat in a sterile interrogation room and unburdened his soul, his voice cracking as he recounted the events of that cold February night. Dale, who was just a teenager working for Earl Calloway at the time, provided a detailed, horrifying roadmap of the crime and the cover-up. His confession was the missing piece, the human testimony that connected the photos, the financial records, and the bodies in the well. He wasn't just a witness. He was a reluctant participant, haunted by the faces of the 5 students for over 4,000 nights. His story was a chilling account of how a simple roadside scam escalated into a mass murder. According to Dale, the trap was a common hustle for the Calloways. Junior would discreetly puncture a tire or slice a hose on an out-of-state car, forcing the driver to return for an overpriced repair. The students were their latest marks. But Liam, sharp and unwilling to be cheated, questioned the absurdly high bill. He argued, calmly at first, but firmly. This defiance, this refusal to be intimidated by a city kid, was an insult Junior Calloway could not tolerate. His rage, a notorious and explosive force in the county, boiled over. He grabbed a heavy tire iron from the garage floor. Dale remembered the sickening sound it made as it connected with the back of Liam's head. Liam collapsed instantly, without a sound. The other 4 students who had been waiting by the car began to scream. In that single, violent moment, a petty crime of extortion became a homicide. The scene descended into chaos, but Earl Calloway, drawn from the office by the screams, was a portrait of icy calm. He saw the situation not as a tragedy, but as a threat to his family, his business, and his control over the town. His decision was instantaneous and utterly ruthless. There could be no witnesses. Dale recounted how Earl locked the garage doors and looked at him, Junior, and another young employee with eyes devoid of any emotion. "They saw everything," Earl had said. "Finish it." What followed was a frenzy of unimaginable violence. The 4 remaining students, cornered and terrified, were systematically murdered to ensure their silence. Sarah and Emily fought back, their screams muffled by the thick garage walls. David and Kevin were overpowered quickly. It was a brutal, desperate act of self-preservation, orchestrated by a patriarch willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to protect his own blood. With 5 bodies on his property, Earl Calloway's methodical mind went to work on the cover-up. Dale described how Earl directed them with the precision of a military commander. They were forced to load the bodies into the back of a company truck and dump them into the old dry well, a place no one had used in 50 years. Earl then personally drove the Jeep Cherokee several miles away, leaving it on the muddy access road with the keys in the ignition to support a runaway theory. He meticulously removed all the luggage, knowing it would be the first thing the families would ask about, and stored it in the back shed. The final step was a phone call to his trusted associate, Sheriff Miller. Dale overheard the conversation. It was brief and transactional. Earl explained the, quote, problem, and a price was agreed upon for the sheriff's full cooperation in misdirecting the investigation and burying the truth. Armed with Dale's confession and the forensic evidence from the well, the FBI moved with swift, decisive force. At dawn the next day, federal agents simultaneously raided the homes of Earl and Junior Calloway, as well as the comfortable lakeside residence of former Sheriff Miller. The arrests were made without incident. The sight of the town's most feared patriarch and his volatile son being led away in handcuffs was a seismic event, a public dismantling of a dynasty built on fear. When Robert and Eleanor received the call, the news landed with the force of a physical blow. 11 years of fighting, hoping, and grieving had led to this moment. The profound agony of knowing how their children died was matched only by a quiet, steely sense of resolution. The uncertainty that had poisoned their lives for so long was finally gone. The truth, in all its horror, had been unearthed, and the long-overdue process of justice could finally begin. The trial of Earl Calloway, Junior Calloway, and former Sheriff Ron Miller became a national media event, held in a federal courthouse far from the small Mississippi town they once controlled. The courtroom was a theater of contrasts. On one side, the cold, unblinking stares of the Calloways, who showed no remorse, and on the other, the stoic, grief-worn faces of the 5 families, who sat together every single day. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, built on the forensic evidence from the well, the damning financial trail, and the haunting images from Sarah's camera. But the most powerful moments came from the testimony of Dale Mathis. Speaking in a low, trembling voice, he walked the jury through every horrifying detail of that night, his guilt a palpable presence in the room. For the first time, the world heard the full, unvarnished story of how a roadside scam ended in a massacre. The verdicts came after just 4 hours of deliberation. Junior Calloway was found guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Earl Calloway, the architect of the cover-up, was convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy and accessory to murder, receiving a sentence that ensured he would die behind bars, which he did 7 years later from a heart attack. Former Sheriff Miller was found guilty of obstruction of justice and corruption, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. For his cooperation, Dale Mathis received a significantly reduced sentence of 5 years for his role in concealing the crime. As the verdicts were read, a wave of quiet, shuddering sobs washed over the families' side of the courtroom. It wasn't joy, but the heavy, final release of a burden they had carried for 11 agonizing years. Leaving the courthouse that final day, Robert and Eleanor walked side by side, not as victors, but as survivors of a war they never chose to fight. The justice they had relentlessly pursued had been delivered, but it couldn't return what they had lost. The truth, once a desperate prayer, was now a known and brutal fact. It provided an ending, a period at the end of a sentence that had been left hanging for over a decade, but it did not heal the wound. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by the grim certainty of their children's final moments. They could finally bury their children, give them a proper resting place, and begin the long, difficult process of grieving a loss that was no longer a mystery, but a permanent and painful part of their history. The fight was over, but the silence their children left behind would last forever. Back in Mississippi, the Callaway name became a curse. The family's local empire, built on fear and intimidation, crumbled into dust. Their properties were seized and sold, their name forever linked to the town's darkest chapter. The community itself was forced into a painful reckoning with its own silence. Many residents expressed a deep sense of shame for their complicity, for looking the other way while a powerful family operated with impunity. The gas station, the epicenter of the tragedy, was finally torn down, its foundations ripped from the earth, as if to exorcise a demon, but erasing the structure couldn't erase the memory. The story of the Mississippi 5 became a cautionary tale, a permanent stain on the town's identity, a reminder of the day that innocence took a wrong turn and never came back. In the years that followed, the families ensured their children's legacy would be one of change, not just tragedy. Fueled by their experience with a broken system, the Roadwatch Foundation grew into a powerful national voice for the missing. Robert, using the legal skills his son had been studying, successfully lobbied Congress, leading to the passage of Sarah and Emily's Law. The legislation mandated new protocols for interstate cooperation in missing persons cases, closing the jurisdictional loopholes that had allowed the initial investigation to fail so catastrophically. The law has since been credited with helping to solve hundreds of cases across the country. Through their pain, the families created a shield for others, transforming their personal loss into a public service, ensuring that no other family would have to fight so hard and for so long simply to be heard. Today, where the Callaway gas station once stood, there is a small, quiet memorial park. 5 young oak trees stand in a line, one for each of the friends. At their base is a simple granite plaque that reads, "Youth is a journey, not a destination. In memory of Liam, Sarah, David, Emily, and Kevin." It's a place of peace, where the sun shines on the ground that once held a terrible secret. For the families, the journey for justice ended here, but the memory of the 5 bright lives, cut short on a dark Mississippi road, endures. Their story is a sobering testament to the depths of human cruelty, but also to the unbreakable strength of a parent's love, and the profound truth that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, can remain hidden from the light forever. The story of the Mississippi 5 is, in the end, a story about what is left behind. Not just the unbearable pain of loss, but the enduring power of memory and the quiet strength of legacy. Where the Callaway gas station once stood as a monument to greed and violence, there is now a small, unassuming park. 5 young oak trees stand in a silent row, their leaves rustling in the Mississippi wind, one for each life that was stolen there. At their base, a simple granite plaque offers a quiet epitaph. Youth is a journey, not a destination. In memory of Liam, Sarah, David, Emily, and Kevin, it is a place not of anger but of peace, a testament to a community's effort to reclaim a piece of ground from its haunted past, transforming a site of unimaginable horror into a space for quiet reflection and remembrance. For the families, the end of the trial was not an end to their grief, but the beginning of a new chapter. They had won the battle for justice, but the war against the kind of systemic failure that allowed their children to be forgotten was just beginning. Robert and Eleanor channeled their pain into the Roadwatch Foundation, transforming it from a small, desperate effort into a national force for change. They became the voice for countless other families lost in the confusing and often indifferent bureaucracy of missing persons cases. They traveled the country, sharing their story not as a tale of tragedy, but as a call to action, ensuring that the lessons learned from their 11-year nightmare would serve as a shield for others. Their children were gone, but their purpose, forged in the fires of loss, had become powerfully, undeniably clear. Their greatest achievement rose directly from the ashes of the investigation's initial, catastrophic failures. The jurisdictional confusion and police indifference that had plagued the case from day one became the target of their relentless advocacy. This culminated in the passage of Sarah and Emily's Law, a landmark piece of federal legislation that fundamentally changed how missing persons cases are handled across state lines. The law mandates immediate cooperation and data sharing between law enforcement agencies, closing the very loopholes that had allowed Sheriff Miller to bury the truth for so long. It was a victory born of profound loss, a systemic change that has since been credited with helping to locate hundreds of missing individuals. In the language of law, the names of two bright, creative young women became synonymous with hope and accountability, a legacy written not on a headstone, but in the federal statutes of the nation. Ultimately, the disappearance of the Mississippi Five serves as a chilling reminder of how easily darkness can fester in the quiet corners of the world, protected by a wall of fear and silence. The Callaways' evil was not an isolated act. It was enabled by a community that chose to look away, by a system that was designed to protect its own, and by a sheriff who sold his badge for a quiet life on the lake. The story is a testament to the terrifying vulnerability of being an outsider in a place with its own rules. But it is also a powerful testament to the unyielding force of a parent's love, a force that refused to let the world forget, a force that dug for the truth for 11 long years, until, against all odds, the ground finally gave up its secrets. The 5 oak trees in Mississippi will continue to grow, their branches reaching for the sky, a living memorial to 5 lives that were not defined by their tragic end, but by the love they inspired and the change they created. Their story is a promise that truth, no matter how deep it is buried, will eventually find its way to the light. It reminds us that every voice matters, and that the search for justice is the most profound way we can honor those who have been silenced. If you believe that no victim should ever be forgotten, and that the relentless pursuit of truth is essential, please share this story. And don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into the cases that demand to be told. Thank you for listening.